It is great to join you from Boston. I'm Vassilis Coutifaris, and we are bringing together 5 of our stellar students who conducted research in Europe last summer, thanks to the senior thesis workshop that we are hosting and the co-chairs, Hannah Calloway and Michael Tworek. We've had the chance to work closely with 5 students this year. First, I want to say a very big thank you to Hannah Calloway for her incredible contributions to the seminar series. As her time at Harvard is coming to an end this summer, thank you so much for everything you've done for this program. And Michael Tworek, thank you for your contribution and for agreeing to remain as chair of this seminar series in the future academic. Hannah, we may begin.
Great. Thanks, Vassilis. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Lily Jacobs.
Hello. Thank you all for having me here. So I'll start by talking a bit about my thesis, just to provide some background / goals for my thesis. I'm a social studies concentrator, by the way. This is mainly a theoretical thesis around the idea of autonomy. It's an intervention in this idea of freedom. And I conducted research in France last summer to frame a case study that I go into in my 3rd chapter. So the goal of this thesis is kind of to rework an idea of autonomy to be more open. And when I say open, I mean kind of expansive to different enactments of freedom that might be culturally specific, and looking specifically at situations when they conflict. What do we do then with our overarching idea of what freedom means? So I take this Frankfurt School idea of autonomy, drawing specifically from Habermas's discourse ethics, which is this idea of like legislating the moral law in a Kantian sense is through like reflexive practices. So we have discussions with other people, we reflect on our beliefs, and through that we come up with kind of like rules and norms and laws. And autonomy arises through this process. And so I take that and I put that in conversation with a lot of critiques of modernity, because this idea of autonomy is heavily entangled in modernity. And there have been a lot of critiques of modernity from like the post-colonial side that are saying like, what if these laws that are freeing us are actually forms of Eurocentric domination? And then critiques from the post-structural side, which raises this question of, can you actually have someone who can engage in these reflexive practices to legislate the moral law and be free? I take these 2 criticisms and I put them in conversation to see whether we can kind of reform this idea of autonomy and uphold it. And eventually I say, yes, we can do that. We can actually find lessons for its reconstruction by really considering these challenges. So the setup for my thesis is chapter 1 looks at kind of the post-colonial criticism. Chapter 2 looks at the post-structural. And I take these 2 ideas from both sides, which I could dub radical reflexivity and narrative embeddedness, and I combine them to outline a recommendation for a deflated and expansive idea of autonomy. And then I test that by turning to the French scarf affair, where I say, this represents a situation where you have different conceptions of what freedom means. By combining the recommendations that I've theoretically worked towards, can we actually come up with like a practical idea of freedom that attends to its criticisms? So that's my general framework for my thesis and my general findings. I'll quickly brush through each of the chapters. So chapter 1 looks at the post-colonial side and looks at how it challenges our idea of autonomy. I diagnose like the critique into this central idea of progress that leads to us, the Euro-American moderns. And I look at how this idea of progress conceptually grounds autonomy. I think I go to a few people who are trying to offer solutions, but I generally say really addressing this criticism will require that we look at the way that progress grounds our normativity. So, and so I eventually turned to a philosopher called Amy Allen, who reconstructs progress using this idea of unlearning. So progress becomes possible when we're willing to unlearn our beliefs. And I say that this is a form of reflexivity in its more radical form, and I take that as one of my recommendations for amending autonomy. Chapter 2, I look at the post-structural criticism and see how it challenges our capacity to be free in the modern sense. So post-structuralism says we're all produced by power. So any decisions you make might be a result of you being socialized into thinking in a specific way through the coercive operations of power in a society. And this causes a lot of problems for how we think of being autonomous. So can you actually reflect on your own beliefs? Can you distance yourself from your own beliefs to become free? Can we determine ourselves if we're constructed by power? So I look to two feminist theorists and their alternate ideas of agency, and look at agency as a way to create space for that autonomy. And I turn to Shayla Benhabib, who is a critical theorist, and her idea of narrative agency and narrative embeddedness. So we are embedded in these narratives that are power laden, but we retain our sense of autonomy in agency by making sense of them. And I take that as my second part in my project of amending autonomy. And then in my third chapter, I take these two recommendations and I ask, all right, like, how successful is this? Can this actually attend to the criticisms that I was originally raising, or these other people have been raising? So can an idea of autonomy that takes these two recommendations actually approach cultural difference without relegating it to the past? Can it be attentive to the way power shapes our realities? Can it be open enough to capture cultural difference? So the case study that I look at is the French scarf affair, which is this ongoing debate in France about the place of religious symbols in the public sphere. It started with a couple of Muslim girls getting expelled from their school for wearing the hijab, and it has progressed into this like ongoing controversy. So you might have heard about the burkini ban or the baby loop case. It's really fascinating. So I actually last summer, thank you CES for helping me do this, I went to France to initially do research on this anti-racist feminist organization called the LOB, which is focused on combating Muslim narratives. And I was really interested in post-colonial feminism, this idea of women defining what freedom means for themselves, no matter how that might conflict with our secular idea of freedom. Unfortunately, when I got to France, I was actually ghosted by the organization a week in. I was able to get in contact with them through Instagram of all things, and was able to interview them a few times, but I actually found out that they had to shut down their operations because they had gotten so much criticism and like death threats and harassment. And I was shocked by this amount of like controversy that had come out of what I thought would be just a pretty normal like anti-racist organization. And I wanted to understand like why this might be and what are the theoretical underpinnings of that. So kind of using that to pivot my research, I then talked to a bunch of government officials and a couple other activist organizations, a few professors, and I isolated this as a case of like what happens when you have different cultural conflicts in our understanding of what freedom means. So like, how do you get to this? Oh, time. Okay. I'll wrap up really quickly. So basically I said this represents a situation where there are different understandings of freedom and a particularly narrow understanding of freedom. I put that in conversation with my prior research, and I ask, like, will my recommendations be able to kind of open our idea of freedom to capture these different enactments? And doing a bit of tinkering with a preliminary framework, I'm able to say, yes, that's what I come to. And my final finding is that we can hold on to an idea of autonomy that's still critical and theoretical, but it has to really be truly reflexive, and it has to really consider the way we're embedded in power. That's
Great.
all.
Thank you, Lily. Our next speaker is Vanessa Ruales. I will turn it over directly to you, Vanessa.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Well, thank you everyone for attending my thesis presentation. It really is an honor to be able to present this body of work to the people who guided me and supported me throughout this time. The topic of my thesis concerns front of package labeling in the UK and Ecuador. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can take a look at a presentation that I've created for this. Okay, it's coming up. All right. On June 19, 2013, the UK Department of Health announced it was releasing its final design of its front of package food labeling system after a decade of developing it. And this is what it looked like. The final design is known as the multiple traffic light labeling system, and it aims to help consumers in making healthier choices. Exactly 5 months after this design was announced in the UK, Ecuador's Ministry of Public Health announced the final design and legal implementation of its own traffic light nutritional labeling system, and it looks like this. Like the UK, the labeling system sought to inform consumers and thereby slow the growth of obesity and obesity-related problems such as diabetes. Although it seems like a seemingly small change in food packaging, experimental research proves its efficacy in changing consumers' food choices for the better. Moreover, the World Health Organization has supported the use of these types of labels in combating the global epidemic in obesity. Still, these two implementations of the traffic light labeling system represent 2 of only 3 successful implementations in the world. So given the political and economic differences between Ecuador and the UK, and the difficulty of implementing this measure, it is of unique academic interest to explain why they arrived at the same outcome. Therefore, my research question is, what factor caused the implementation of traffic light labeling in the UK and Ecuador? The policy process literature surrounding this seeks to explain why policies are implemented usually centers around several theories. The most commonly is what's known as the multiple streams framework, and the other would be the advocacy coalition framework. The former is a theory of policy change that says that policy change happens when a policy window develops. That is, when you have an event that brings attention to a certain policy issue, and when you have bureaucrats already having a preference for tackling this policy, and when electoral politics favor it, then a policy window is created. The latter theory, the advocacy coalition framework, is a theory that asserts that the strength of networks is the main independent variable in policy change. So instead of applying one theory to this method, I wanted to apply a more rigorous approach in which several theories are synthesized. Because of the strength of public health networks in each case study, at this particular point of time in which they were implemented, I hypothesized that the advocacy coalition network was an applicable theory in conjunction with the multiple streams framework. So in other words, I hypothesized that the increased strength of public health networks in each case study in conjunction with a policy window leads to the implementation of traffic light labeling systems in both of these case studies. In order to do this, I traced the process of agenda setting and implementation in both of these countries by a scoping of news articles and government documents between 2000 and 2018, as well as conducting 10 interviews of relevant policy actors from the following organizations that you see on your screen. Now, while I don't have a lot of time to get into the details of how each policy progressed, roughly in the UK, there was an outbreak of mad cow disease in 1996, and that led to the creation of the Food Standards Agency in 2000. the people in the Food Standards Agency, FSA, decided to take on nutrition as well and began working on nutritional labeling around 2004, releasing the first technical guidance of the traffic light labeling system in 2007. With the turn of the Labour Party to the Conservative Party, there were more changes made and a final design was implemented in 2013. In Ecuador, the process of creating and implementing the label occurred in 2 years, but I traced the events leading to the implementation leading up to its implementation. In 2007, the left-wing president, Rafael Correa, was elected after decades of presidencies with abuses of power. He, in close relationship with the Ministry of Public Health, undertook an overhaul of the country's fragmented public health system and established universal health care in 2010. With more funding, MSP, the Ministerio de Salud Pública, the Ministry of Public Health ministers, focused on obesity, conducting the country's first national nutritional survey in 2012. And its staggering results showing the country's obesity epidemic led the researchers who conducted the study to be critically influential and advising the MSP to take on traffic light nutritional labeling systems as opposed to any other measure. And so by 2014, the labeling system had been implemented through a ministerial accord. So when applying both policy theories to these cases, I found that they explain most events, but they don't explain why this specific labeling system was chosen over other obesity prevention measures, such as limiting junk food advertising, for instance, or implementing another type of labeling system. Instead, I found that the main variable in these two cases actually was institutionally based. In both cases, there was an uncommonly autonomous health-related body that pushed for the traffic light labeling system. The Food Standards Agency and the Ministry of Public Health in Ecuador were able to have this high level of autonomy through the focusing events of, for instance, mad cow disease in the UK, creating the highly autonomous Food Standards Agency. And the focusing event of the Ministry of Public Health receiving more funding and more endowed autonomy by the president to be able to focus on preventive issues like obesity and the traffic light labeling system through the conducting of the nutritional survey. So in each case, there were strong networks of public health leaders who researched and pushed the traffic light labeling system as opposed to other measures. And therefore, we see that with strong institutions, with strong public health networks, that is critical in creating a policy window that then led to these measures being implemented in both countries. So through doing this research, I found several lessons. And specifically, the lessons for public health researchers in the policy process field is that synthesis theory is a useful application to assessing obesity prevention, and it provides a lot more breadth for exploring possible independent variables in policy change. And for public health practitioners, I found this was very interesting. Firstly, that the strength of networks is crucial in obesity prevention, that there be a consensus about a specific policy like traffic light labeling. And secondly, that change can occur in both legal and non-legal spheres. In the UK, we saw that it actually was a voluntary measure that now is implemented in most food outlets and most supermarkets. And in Ecuador, it was a ministerial accord, which means that it was not passed through legislative forms. So that was my thesis. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank the Center for European Studies for making this research possible. It really, having the opportunity to be a scholar of the UK, in the UK, was a remarkable experience, and really even more so with the fact that hopefully this kind of research can inform policy change in the future. So thank you again for that.
Great, thank you, Vanessa. And our next speaker is Rebecca Thau. So Rebecca, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. And thank you to the Center for European Studies for organizing this event. It's been such a pleasure to hear about Lily and Vanessa's projects, and I look forward to hearing about my other colleagues' work in the next few minutes. My name is Rebecca Thau. I concentrate jointly in history and literature and French. The title of my thesis was French Theory, the Intellectual Reverberations of Hélène, Cixous, Juiféminité. And I would be remiss not to thank my wonderful advisors, Kate Brackney and François Lyonnais. So a huge thank you to them for all of their guidance and help with this process. Hélène Cixous is one of the world's most influential living thinkers and a key player in the intellectual movement that is known in this country as French theory. My thesis delved specifically into the apparently non-French components of Cixous' identity, specifically what I call her Juiféminité, her combined Jewish and feminine background. Being a Jewish woman shapes the way in which Cixous understands herself to be on the peripheries of the Jewish, Algerian, and French communities. Understanding the appearance and negation of the various components of Cixous' non-French background, and in turn understanding her body of work, requires an exploration of this crucial Juiféminité. In my first chapter, I specifically explore the implications of Cixous' Juiféminité on her self-definition as a Jew. There, I argue that Cixous approaches her Jewishness through a series of negations. She is secular, yet engages deeply with Judaism. She dreams of Zion, yet opposes Zion. As Juif femme, Jewishness itself is a type of as a woman in a patriarchal religious tradition, she never has full access to Jewishness. My second chapter explores Cixous' national non-affiliation. Juiféminité prevents Cixous from fully belonging in either her native Algeria or in France, where she moved in 1955. I analyzed Cixous' paradoxical relationship to Algeria, characterized both by trauma and romantic nostalgia, romantic longing, and contrast that contradiction-laden relationship with her comparatively clearer alienation from an apparently purely anti-Semitic France. As a Juif femme, and Cixous appears to permanently resist classification. Traditional frameworks of belonging do not seem to apply to her. I concluded my thesis by asking then where Cixous finally belongs. And I came up with two answers, the first of which is her multinational collage-like apartment in Paris and the Château de Montagne in France's Dordogne region, which Cixous elevates to the status of personal myth. Throughout my thesis, I was conscious particularly of Cixous' use of contradictions. Upholding these paradoxes, that is, acknowledging that Cixous intends to leave readers with unanswered questions, matters as much, if not much more, than pinning Cixous down into any one particular truth. Given the nature of her work, such an attempt will inherently fail. So this thesis was what I call a deconstructionist intellectual biography, one that attempted to trace the implications of Cixous' Juiféminité without flattening the rich, contradiction-laden personhood that she so skillfully crafts. Outside of the academy, my analysis has implications for France's current efforts to integrate minority communities, especially marginalized Algerian and Jewish citizens. Understanding Cixous' female, Jewish, and Algerian experiences can teach us about the present and future of the French universal ideal more broadly. So with the assistance and funding of the Center for European Studies, as well as the Center for Jewish Studies and Department of Romance, Languages, and Literatures, I was able to go to 4 different archives in France, as well as one in the United States to do some archival research. These included in the US, the University of California, Irvine, which houses Derrida's papers, as well as the French National Library in Paris, which houses the Cixous papers, the Alliance Israélite Universelle collection, particularly the Jacques Lasrousse papers, which deal with Algerian Jews in the post-war period. IMEC, which is, if you saw the publicity materials for this, was this lovely picture of an abbey with some plants. That's the archive. It's this beautiful archive in Normandy, IMEC, which houses Derrida papers and lots of really rich correspondences between Cixous and Derrida. And I'm also very grateful that during January, I was able to return to Paris and interview Cixous herself. So my thesis also breaks new ground in that it is providing a brand new interview with Cixous, which will be kept in her papers in completion and will be a resource for those interested in her work and writing about her work, scholarly pursuits about Cixous, about post-structuralism for generations to come, which is a very exciting piece of this project for me. I'm also very honored that my thesis was awarded both the Edward Chandler Cumming Prize for the thesis of highest distinction in history and literature, as well as the Harry and Cecile Starr Prize for the best thesis in Jewish studies. And none of that would be possible without the Center for European Studies and all of your support. So thank you so very much. And I look forward to hearing any questions that you might have later on in the hour. And I look forward to hearing from my colleagues here their projects.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. Our next speaker is May Wang. I will turn it right over to you, May.
Sure. I'm also going to sort of start sharing my screen. So pardon me while I arrange my screen. While I do that, I'll briefly introduce myself. Is this working for everybody? Great. I'm May. I'm in the comparative literature department, and my thesis, generously supported by the Center for European Studies, was titled Observing Opposites, Optics, Character, and Narrative in these two novels, a Thomas Hardy one called Return of the Native, and a Gustave Flaubert novel, Bouvard et Pécuchet, which was published posthumously. I'd like to echo all my peers who have come before me in thanking you all for coming to these presentations, and in my gratitude for CES's support throughout this thesis process. We've been fortunate to meet a few times, and it's been really exciting to stay updated with my colleagues' work. So today I'll be talking about my thesis, which sought to articulate the ways in which 19th century novels were profoundly structured with new modes of scientific knowledge and its production in England and France particularly. Specifically, I examined how two novelists in the 19th century, Thomas Hardy and Gustave Flaubert, posed questions about the aesthetic implications of new epistemic anxieties that marked this era of rapidly modernizing science. And I posit that Hardy's Return of the Native and Flaubert's Bouvard et Pécuchet both respectively accept and undermine late 19th century notions of objectivity through culturally and scientifically significant objects of windows, mirrors, and lenses, and I'll go into a bit more detail there. These objects made from glass in the texts disclose opposites and opposition that in doing so embody the scientific and aesthetic concerns of the end of the 19th century, especially as precipitated by new discoveries, I think, into the nature of light. So the historians of science, Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison, have characterized the 19th century as an era in which epistemic virtues of objectivity and subjectivity were both confused and hardened. And you can sort of see it in these two, or one of the examples that they offer are these illustrations. On the left is an earlier sort of mid-19th century example of a scientist trying to characterize the way in which a water droplet sort of spreads out. And they would do this by illustrating and sort of essentializing the phenomenon. With the advent of photography, their understanding of these phenomena, like a water droplet, or even more profound phenomena like the nature of light, became much more confused because they were actually discovering inconsistencies, and it was not something that you could distill. It was not a phenomenon that you could distill into one sort of characteristic illustration. So scientific inquiry began to regulate the way in which the observer attended to experimental conditions, but also the scientist of the late 19th century learned to sort of distrust his or her sort of personal role and judgment in observation, and force their expressive self into a degree of passivity, while also having to maintain a sort of active critical distance from their subject. So the self of the 19th century scientist was a balance between the active and the passive, and the observer and scientist hardened terms of objectivity and subjectivity in what appeared to be polar opposites. And I think certainly in today's culture, it comes down as sort of very opposed frameworks of thinking, which sort of resembles emerging theories of light as a electromagnetic phenomena of the 19th century. So like the scientist, actual natural phenomena were becoming characterized as delicate and tense interplay of extremes. So I specifically examined this in these two novels, which I broadly characterized on this slide. And I specifically wanted to, as I was reading them, I specifically noticed that there are a lot of interventions through basically the various devices, often made of glass. And some cultural and literary historians have characterized the 19th century as have characterized the medium of glass as maybe the defining substance of the century. And you can sort of see this in the picture I've included in this slide of the 1851 Crystal Palace. And so in these novels, I specifically looked at windows, mirrors, and lenses. And I mentioned those actually in a specific order of degrees of utility that disclose and constrain knowledge about the characters to one another as employed through narrative techniques, but also the way in which information gets sort of disclosed to the reader, or the way the story unfolds for the reader as well. And in doing so, the novels enact and embody their respective stances towards the shifting epistemological frameworks of the 19th century science. So I'll quickly, I mean, since this is a sort of a literary thesis, I would definitely encourage you to read the novels to get a sense of what I'm talking about, but I'll quickly run through maybe some of the specific passages that I was looking at that I think really stood out to me through these devices. The first is the window, which is sort of the most passive of the devices that kind of enable characters to witness life-altering events. For example, in Return of the Native, these two sort of opposed characters in this romantic couple first encounter one another through a window, and in Bouvard and Pécuchet, these two opposed characters experience life-changing and sort of epistemological framework-changing events through a window. In my second chapter, I looked at mirrors, which are really interesting in a sort of scientific sense of the way in which the image gets produced. And this is kind of echoed in the novels, where there's a certain inaccessibility to the image that, or the sort of subject that is produced in the mirror. So in Return of the Native, this occurs in a scene that basically disintegrates these two characters' marriage. And in Bouvard and Pécuchet, it brings up sort of modern science against sort of pseudoscience, and questions both modern and pseudoscience, and are sort of modes of evaluating their usefulness. In my final chapter, I look at lenses, or sort of lensing effects in the two texts. In both, in Return of the Native, two characters are kind of characterized like two images converging as though in lenses. One is of shadows and one is of light. And so by those characterizations, they're kind of brought into opposition with one another, and we are asked to consider what it means that they're brought into opposition with one another. And in Bouvard and Pécuchet, very self-reflexively, the novel sort of criticizes contemporary writers like Balzac as being sort of overwhelmingly descriptive, as though you're looking at something under a microscope, and that somehow lessens the aesthetic force of the novel. And so in the broader view of these devices in the novels, I came to the conclusion that Return of the Native sort of enacts the modes of empirical knowledge production and uses them to interrogate their consequences, whereas in Bouvard and Pécuchet, it sort of embodies it to a satirical extent. It's a very difficult novel to read, because it's constantly trying to refute traditional forms, and part of what it is doing that through the scientific through scientific sort of values. And it concludes pretty uneventfully, or actually the notes that Flaubert leaves for what the conclusion would have been, leaves it very sort of uneventful. And this lack of sort of fulfilling end kind of perhaps signifies Flaubert's lack of faith in the productivity of the scientific approach, and maybe even also the form of the traditional 19th century novel. And so for an even broader view on this project, I see this as a way to analyze, as this particular project as one instance of analyzing the profound interwovenness of literature and the physical sciences, especially in the 19th century, and is a way of understanding this epistemic divide that sort of gets hardened in the 19th century and I think has persisted into today between objectivity and subjectivity and scientific values and aesthetic values. And I'll conclude by just, again, acknowledging, okay, great. So I couldn't see you, I think, because I was sharing my screen, but I'll, by thanking my, my advisor in the comparative literature department, Katarina Pichowski, who has been wonderfully supportive throughout this process, as well as my other colleagues in the complet department. And of course, the Center for European Studies, who generously funded research for me in France and England to really get hands-on experience with a lot of these history of science phenomena. Yeah.
Thank you, May. Our final speaker is Selena Zhao. Selena, I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, let me screen share, but I'm Selena. I study government and sorry. Okay, here we go. Is that full screen for everyone or no? Okay, hold on. All right, well, my notes are also on my computer, so I might actually just, is it okay? I'll just leave it like this. Okay, so I want to echo everyone in thanking the CES for making this possible. Particularly, this presentation is pretty short, so I want to actually not do like a kind of traditional thesis presentation, but really flesh out the ways that fieldwork in particular during my summer in Belfast has changed the angle of my research and led to a much more in-depth kind of research question. And also led to like postgraduate plans and all this stuff based on my experience in Belfast. So my thesis is on the power sharing arrangement under the Good Friday Agreement, which ended 30 years of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And so here's Northern Ireland. And essentially the Good Friday Agreement allocates power based on your ethno-religious identity. So whether you're Protestant or Catholic, nationalist or unionist. And I originally applied for funding just to conduct interviews with politicians to understand how politicizing ethnic identity would actually incentivize politicians to entrench that sectarianism in their political rhetoric. And this is controversial because power sharing in the Good Friday Agreement was intended to do the very opposite and to create bridges and promote reconciliation. And what I took for granted until I arrived in Belfast was that the literature basically said that under kind of instrumental theories in political science and social psychological theories, that essentially if you have a politician, an elite called an ethnic entrepreneur who decides to exploit a certain identity, they can essentially form identities out of non-salient identities, as was the case in Yugoslavia, and bring something that wasn't really in the fore of people's minds. And make that the main identity that they identify with. And so that's kind of what the literature said, was that if elites were exploiting it, it would kind of, the masses would automatically follow this exploitation, identify more greatly. But as soon as I got to Belfast, I actually saw a much different picture than what was painted. And so here you can see kind of all the traditional ways that Northern Ireland might still be characterized. These are the July 15th bonfires. That's the Irish flag burning. They burn a picture of the an Irish-leaning politician. You see here all the murals, the peace walls. Things don't seem really settled since the conflict, and that's kind of the way the literature portrayed it as well. But then when I got there, I actually saw that, you know, there's such a vibrant tourism scene. There's a lot of ways in which most of my off-the-record conversations really informed my research. And a lot of people were very much willing to put behind kind of the former identities, these bifurcated Protestant or Catholic, as the only possible identities, and to emerge and to subscribe to a growing Northern Irish identity or to identify as neither nationalist nor unionist. And this definitely was not predicted in the literature at all. And I also wasn't trying to like research this at all. But this is the puzzle that actually emerged, was that the literature would predict that while elites are still exploiting these divisions, mass kind of subscription to these binary identities would also be heavy, but instead they're lessening over time. And so I kind of came to this puzzle where there's a divergence between elite and mass sectarianism, which wasn't conceptualized at all in the literature. And so through my interviews with politicians and business leaders and civic leaders, I found that very much what was being predicted at the elite level was true. And here, I'll skip forward to this slide. Very much politics is framed by this binary division. The ethno-religious parties at each extreme end carry most of the votes. Their electoral support is mainly based on, you know, keeping the other side out, vote for me, or you don't want the Shinners in power, something like that. They're kind of maintaining their power by supporting segregated policies. 97% of education is segregated in Northern Ireland, and 70% of people want more integration, and yet there's no political impetus because the politicians in power get their support from that very segregation. But on the other hand, you have this unpredicted and surprising outcome, which is that mass sectarianism is decreasing. By now, 50% of people identify as neither nationalist nor unionist. And through surveys through the Northern Ireland Life and Times public opinion databases, you can see that willingness to interact across the divisions is much greater. And in behavioral measures as well, from kind of like attendance at funerals for ethnic leaders, or the incidence of sectarian hate crimes, all of these behavioral measures are also decreasing. And you can see in this graph, it's kind of small, but the attitude towards intermarriage and approval has actually increased from 46 to 72%, just over 2 decades, which is a very, very large increase. So I set about to kind of explain this divergence. And another thing I noticed was that also in a lot of off the record conversations, as much as on the record, for example, the first host I came in contact with in Belfast, when I was actually staying on a farm, she told me, like, I really don't care who you interview. Like, I don't care which party they're in. I'm just fed up that the government's been shut down for 3 years and I just want it back and running again. And that kind of fed a lot of the public survey statistics that I actually looked into afterwards. Levels of just tremendous government dissatisfaction, as you can see here, leading to abstention, bankrupt public sectors based on just 5 shutdowns in the last 2 decades, multiple lasting for over 3 years. People are really fed up with the government. People think that they're really, their petty squabbles are coming at the expense of their children's education. People are voting less. And so I hypothesize that there's actually a bound in which elites are no longer able to effectively exploit these kinds of easy sectarian divisions if government performance is poor enough. And this conceptualization is pretty, if I may say so myself, like not present in the literature at this time. There isn't a distinction between mass and elite levels of sectarianism. So that conceptualization is also a lot of what I'm offering. And that is something that I never would have picked up had I not really gone to Northern Ireland and talked to people. And so these are a lot of the implications, or that you can kind of see tenets of this in other countries with institutions that are based on ethno-religious divisions, like in Bosnia and Lebanon, where in protest they also say, you know, I'm a Serb, a Croat, a Bosniak, and I can say that I'm hungry in all 3 languages. So you can see that kind of poor government performance is actually leading to an overarching kind of identity. And it proposes questions for whether we should be proposing institutions based on ethno-religious divisions to end ethno-religious violence, and whether that's a kind of viable institutional solution, and whether if maybe that's necessary just to end violence, that some kind of transition needs to be in place. And that's something we're thinking about, to like move to a more normal or majoritarian form of democracy. That's something that's being proposed in Syria, in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, and also in the ways that we think about the ways that elites can utilize ethnic rhetoric, which is something we see in the US. This has also been a really formative personal experience for me. I'm gonna spend my next year probably continuing this research on a master's in Belfast, Queen's University in Belfast, studying conflict transformation, and that's my application to the fellowship. The Mitchell was very much based on my fieldwork. I also want to mention that the thesis won a Philo Sherman Bennett Prize from the government department on the principles of free government. And I only want to say this to really, really thank the CES for making this in-person fieldwork possible, because I don't think my thesis would have had this kind of depth of analysis without having actually been there and talking to people, both in formal and informal ways. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Selena. I will turn it over now to Michael Torek, who will facilitate our Q&A.
Thank you so much, Hannah. And first and foremost, thank you so much to all of our wonderful CES presenters today. Congratulations on the remarkable work that you've done. And I think everyone will agree this is a testament to what supporting fantastic research can really yield. Some of the incredible insights that you've offered. We're absolutely grateful for you sharing it with us, and I look forward to the questions that we'll receive. So to give a little sense of the Q&A to our attendees, if you could send your questions to the Q&A function within Zoom. If you have a general question, highlight that it's a general question to all the panelists, and if you have a specific question, please also note to whom that question is directed. General questions might not be as clear to me at this point because we're not engaging in a live Q&A in that sense. But if you can highlight if you have a specific question for someone by their name, I would greatly appreciate that. So let's start with our first general question that we received here. This will be for all the panelists. What was your favorite element in this research that you'd like to share with us? So let us start with Lily. And if you can all keep your answers as concise as possible so we can get to all of them, that would be wonderful. Lily, please.
Oh, I don't know. Lots of favorite elements. I love just talking to people, and I feel like a lot of the conversations that I had forced me to reevaluate my own worldview as much as it did help me understand the subject that I was researching. Yeah, the best part was having those genuine conversations with people, which was just such an invaluable experience and such special conversations.
Thank you. Vanessa?
I think that my favorite element would have to be being in the UK and specifically being in Cambridge, where there's a lot of different health organizations and researchers coming together and directly advising the government, and seeing how they do that and how they have these close relationships, and how many of them are themselves just, the researchers are the officials themselves, such as in the Food Standards Agency, was really amazing to see the direct impact that they have.
Thank you, Vanessa. Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, first I'll have to echo Lily that it was just such a marvelous experience. Choosing one favorite is, of course, a difficult thing to do, but I would say one of my favorite elements was I don't know if this happened to any of you all as well, but I would keep, people would keep being confused that I was doing an undergraduate thesis. I'd be like, yeah, no, I'm doing my undergraduate thesis. They'd be like, so your doctorate. So you're in the archive for your doctorate. And it was just a very funny experience that reminded me constantly just how amazing it was that I was able to go to these archives and these libraries and do all of this marvelous research.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rebecca. May?
Yeah, I like Lily, I enjoyed a lot of the informal interactions I got to have as well, and learned a lot. I think I'm sure there's a way in which it informed the way that I read, and I think my favorite element probably would be that I got to like be in, like experience the geography, because especially I hadn't yet settled on Thomas Hardy, but what's really interesting about Thomas Hardy's work is that he actually does this entire project of constructing his entire fiction. All of his novels exist in this like fictional world that is based very much on like English countryside, and it's very present in the novel that I read. And like one of my original interests is sort of in the way in which space gets like articulated into novels. So being able to like experience the geography both in a sort of critical analytical way, but also just in a like living way, I think also certainly influenced the way that I analyze things, and also was really formative in a personal sense as well.
Thank you so much, May. Selena?
Yeah, as much as my research is supposed to be neutral, there's definitely like normative implications. And if there were like kind of partisan implications, I feel like the far right would be like the villains of my like thesis implications. And I would not have had any other like excuse to like talk to them, but I really, really enjoyed my conversations. They were really informative, incredibly humanizing, empathetic. And I think I gained a lot, like just as a person, from having these kinds of conversations.
Thank you so much, Selena. I think hearing that human component, which, you know, often when people think of research, they think it's, you know, dry, just dusty archives, number crunching, but that human component comes to the fore very much, especially from your individual experiences. We have another great general question. So what was your biggest challenge that you faced, and what was your biggest surprise in the course of your research? Let's start with Lily.
I think the biggest challenge that I faced, there were a lot, was just kind of learning to be comfortable with the ambiguity of research. I didn't realize how much of research was figuring out what you were researching. And I was definitely like intimidated and scared by that, but like learning to be open like in what you're researching, and just like be confident in your ability to keep going. And the biggest surprise is that I was able to finish and that I could keep going and create something when I thought I couldn't. Yeah, and also like it's such a surprise like how much I learned for myself, like, and how like I think of life and think of people and think of like culture and our most basic ideals, how much that would transform my own perception as a person. I didn't know I would be transformed at that level, but yes.
Thank you, Lily. Vanessa?
The biggest challenge that I faced in doing this, I think, is similar to what Lily was saying. Just the process of researching and conducting that is difficult. And for me specifically, I wouldn't do an interview-based thesis just because it seemed like that was the right methodology for the question that I wanted to answer. But I didn't know how I didn't really like to do interviews. It's really difficult to get them logistically. It takes a very long time to do it. And then finally, when I was in the UK, I wanted way more interviews than I got, and I had to expand my thesis to include Ecuador in order to obtain a good amount that I could analyze. So that was a challenge. Did your question also involve what did you like about?
Biggest surprise.
Biggest surprise. I think that was it. I did not think I was going. I mean, I applied to a Center for European Studies thesis grant. I thought I was going to focus entirely on the UK, but I ended up doing a comparative study with Ecuador, which I think proved to be more interesting and more rigorous.
Thank you, Vanessa. Rebecca?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest challenge was having to cut down what I was doing. I originally, my plan when I first applied for a grant at the CES included, it was on Cixous and Thau, which is also why I went to a bunch of his archives. And I came to school with like 500 pages of notes, and I was like, great, time to write a 100-page thesis. And quickly realized that I had to drastically cut down the scope of what I was doing because that's just not possible. And so that was probably a challenge, trying to figure out how to get a research question that would be pointed enough to answer effectively in the amount of pages I had. And then the surprise, I think, I started reading Cixous because I didn't understand her, and I wanted to understand her. My thought was, if I do a thesis on her, I'll understand her. And came to the conclusion that that's not true. That she, as I indicated in my presentation, her writing is intentionally laden with contradictions. She changes her positions on things. And that's part of her modus operandi. That's just what she does. And so a big surprise of the process was that I could spend months reading hundreds of pages that this woman wrote, reading her notes that she scribbled. She was half talking to her at her dining room table, and still walk away not knowing.
Thank you, Rebecca. May?
Yeah, I think my challenge, it was like a little bit more mundane, but I think had sort of profound effects of the time difference. And I think maybe we're experiencing it sort of now, is the difficulty of sort of consulting and sort of interacting with people, communing with people asynchronously. I found it forced me to sort of learn to trust my like personal judgment, and sort of, yeah, as I think other people have mentioned, it really informed a lot of personal growth from this like very, just the fact that I couldn't like instantaneously be communicating with people. I think the biggest surprise is really more like gratitude that it like the doors opened surprisingly easily, and I like was just constantly really grateful that that I was able to like articulate a project that I was interested in, also had both the like monetary and sort of I guess like name support to be able to enter into spaces, and it felt like anything was at my fingertips.
Thank you so much, May. Selena?
Yeah, definitely echoing the surprise at like how easily, if I just like cold emailed people, they'd actually respond for interviews. That was probably the surprise, and also the challenge as well. Definitely like trying to embrace the uncertainty. I like went in being like, oh, I have to be legit. Like I got funding, like I'm like living here for a few months. Like I really need to like actually know what I'm doing. And I tried to do so much research in advance to like feel like I, like had my bearings when I got there. But I realized that like there's just so much that's not communicated in the literature that you really need to be there and to just start asking questions that interest you, not necessarily sticking to like, oh, here's my research question and I'm just collecting data to like check the boxes. And like that extended into like the CES like 10-minute presentation we gave. Like I still had no idea where my thesis was going, even like retroactively at that point, like post field research. So just trying to like embrace uncertainty the entire way was a real challenge. Probably also a surprise that it worked out at all. I definitely, like Lily, feel like I can't believe any sort of finished product happened.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Selena. Vassilis, do we have time for one very quick question that I think will summarize very nicely the impact of this research?
Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. So one last question to all of you. What would you advise your pre-summer research trip self? Is there anything you would have done differently to prepare for this field research? Let's start with Lily.
I think two things. The first thing would be like, be open to the idea that you don't actually know what you don't know, and like carry that humility in your research and conversations. And then the second thing is like be confident in your ability to handle that uncertainty that Selena was talking about, that will be inevitable, but be confident in your ability to like change plans, follow new questions, and like wade through that ambiguity.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lily. Vanessa?
Yeah, I really like what Lily said about wading through that ambiguity, because I think that was one of the things that I would have told myself, to be a bit more confident about the work that I'm doing and of its value. And even especially in the UK, where a lot of times when you would go up to public health researchers and tell them what you were doing, and they found out that you're an undergraduate, they would not be that as inclined to speak to you as if you were a graduate student. And then also, I think like possibly a bit more preparation in the quantitative sciences would have been good, because I think that later on I realized ways that I could have applied that, and I wished I would have applied that, and I think I would have enjoyed a combination of like a mixed methods of like a theoretical thesis with something statistical.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vanessa. Rebecca? Rebecca?
I was on mute. Yeah.
My apologies. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Wonderful. Getting Zoom, the hang of Zoom is still taking a while. But yeah, something I would advise my pre-summer self was to be open to learning, not just in the place like the archive or library where I was reading the documents to do the research. I was really surprised by how much, when I had these research questions in my mind, how much they popped up all over the place in Paris, right? Like I would get out of the metro, and there were for weekends, for months, excuse me, every weekend there would be a demonstration, a pro-democracy in Algeria demonstration at Place de la République in the 11th district in Paris. And so, these things would just pop up that would be relevant to my research. And I don't think I anticipated having it be so present in daily life like that, but because it was in my mind and also, of course, in the ether, it came up outside of the library and outside of the archives too. And I didn't realize that until I was there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rebecca. May?
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything people have said of embracing the uncertainty. I think that's a big part of the process. I would take that a step further, and like for me personally, it was really I had to write. I was encouraged to like write everything down, and also I think maybe just kind of because I'm a hoarder, but I like tried to collect like all the things from the museums that I went to, and have to like have like physical artifacts, and also be articulating what you remember and what you experienced, because like Rebecca was saying, there's a lot of sort of incidental things that in the process, like 5 months later you'll be like, oh, I think I encountered that, like where did I encounter that? So I think there's a degree a degree of moderation to be struck, but valuing everything that you're experiencing, I think. Whatever way, for me, it's like writing and collecting and being really diligent about it, but whatever way helps you remember.
Wonderful. Thank you, May. Selena?
Yeah, I think I would just tell myself to take the plunge, like read less, talk to people more. I spent the first week like hiding on a farm, listening to podcasts, trying to like feel more legitimate before I interviewed people. Like I wish I just started sooner, like it's okay. No one's going to second guess you as much as you are yourself.
Don't be your own worst enemy, I think is the theme that emerged from that. Well, before I turn it over to Vassilis and Hannah to conclude this, I'd like to thank and congratulate you as well. It's such a pleasure to see your work evolve from our mini conference earlier in the year through this point, and I wish you all the best in all of your future endeavors. Vassilis, Hannah?
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, and thank you so much to all of our presenters, of all of the different roles that I have at Harvard, things I've done. This working with the CES applications and then grant winners is so incredibly rewarding for the reasons that all of you are talking about in your incredible projects, right? The amazing work that you do, and then also just watching the research process unfold for you and the kind of wonder of it, of getting to the research site and being kind of bowled over by all of these issues and problems, and then discovering that your project evolves. Like, it's an experience I think that never goes away in research, and that is, it's such an incredible part of it. And you're so absolutely right, all of you who highlighted, like, you just have to be there, right? And you have to kind of embark on these projects and let them unfold. So thank you for sharing your incredible findings, and also the sort of wonder of the process with all of us here. And thank you so much to CES for facilitating, for making all of this possible.